Welcome back again. Please, before we start, comment down below where you are and what time it is there right now. Let's get to it. Shannon Gilbert was just 23 years old when she vanished on the morning of May 1st, 2010. A hopeful young woman, originally from Jersey City, New Jersey, Shannon worked as an escort, advertising her services on Craigslist. Despite her line of work, she had ambitions beyond it. She dreamed of becoming a singer and had been saving money to help her pursue that goal. Friends and family noted her determination, though they also admitted Shannon had her struggles. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and occasionally missed taking her prescribed medication. On the night of her disappearance, though, it wasn't her past struggles or aspirations that took center stage. It was the growing fear in her voice as she made what would become one of the most haunting 911 calls in modern crime history. Shannon was last seen in a gated community in Oak Beach, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood on Long Island's South Shore. That evening, she had been accompanied by her driver, Michael Pack, as part of her work arrangement. In this line of work, it was not unusual to have someone drive and wait nearby to ensure a semblance of security. She had arranged to meet a client named Joseph Brewer, a local resident who lived in this suburban enclave. What exactly happened during their interaction remains unclear, but by the early hours of the morning, Shannon was terrified. At 4:51 a.m., she placed a frantic call to 911, claiming someone was after her. The call stretched on for over 20 minutes. In the chilling audio, Shannon's voice wavered between panic and exhaustion. She repeatedly told the dispatcher, "They're going to kill me," though she didn't provide much clarity on who they were. Her fear was palpable, a kind of raw vulnerability that sticks with you when you hear it. The Suffolk County Police Department, who later made the audio available to the public after years of legal battles, initially treated the call as a low-priority matter. But for Shannon, this was the last lifeline she would grab onto before vanishing into the cold morning air. It is said that during the call, she mentioned both Brewer and Pack, though neither man was charged in relation to her disappearance. Their accounts of that night were inconsistent yet strangely untethered to the gravity of what ended up happening. While on the phone, Shannon left Brewer's house abruptly and began knocking on neighboring doors, pleading for help. At one point, she reached the house of Gus Coletti, an older gentleman who answered her frantic knocks. He later recalled that Shannon looked disoriented and scared, refusing to step inside when he opened the door. Instead, she stood on his porch, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Coletti tried to offer assistance, even calling 911 himself after she bolted from his home. Another neighbor, Barbara Brennan, reportedly saw Shannon running across her yard, still in distress. These accounts painted an unsettling picture of a woman desperate to escape something, or someone, unknown. By 5:30 a.m., Shannon was gone. Witnesses claimed to have seen her run into the marshy wetlands near Oak Beach, a tangle of tall grass and uneven terrain difficult to navigate even in daylight. When police finally arrived, her absence was written off as a case of a woman fleeing into the night, the subtext being that her job somehow made her disappearance less urgent. She was dismissed, not as a victim but as someone who had simply wandered off in a highly emotional state. Yet, her family refused to accept this narrative and immediately began pushing for a more thorough investigation. For Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mother, the lack of urgency in those early hours only deepened her resolve to uncover the truth about what happened to her daughter. The Suffolk County Police Department didn't treat the case with the seriousness it would later demand. Their initial theory was that Shannon had become disoriented and drowned in the marsh, possibly due to her mental health condition or substances, though there was little evidence to support this assumption at the time. Few officers took into account her documented fear on the 911 call, or her very clear actions of running and seeking help. This casual dismissal would set the stage for years of frustration amongst Shannon's family, particularly Mari, who grew increasingly vocal about law enforcement's apparent apathy. As Mari publicized her daughter's story, she told reporters and investigators, if this were anyone else's child, they'd be looking by now. Months later, due largely to Mari's persistence, law enforcement launched a more coordinated search for Shannon in December 2010. The effort initially focused on ending her within a tight radius of where she was last seen. During one of these searches, on an unassuming stretch of Gilgo Beach, not far from Oak Beach, investigators stumbled upon the remains of a woman. The chilling part? They weren't Shannon's remains. Instead, during that search on December 11, officers found the skeletal remains of another woman wrapped in burlap. What should have been an isolated, tragic discovery quickly unraveled into something far darker when, over the subsequent days, 3 more sets of remains were discovered in the same area, all within 500 feet of one another. Each belonged to a young woman, all petite, all in their 20s, and all escorts who, like Shannon, advertised their services online. This grouping of victims, later dubbed the Gilgo Four, turned Shannon's disappearance from a quiet local case into the beginnings of one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer investigations. The Suffolk County Homicide Squad, once reluctant to devote resources, now found themselves at the epicenter of a growing nightmare. Despite the proximity of the remains, missing persons reports for each of the Gilgo Four had previously been dealt with as unrelated cases. It was only their discovery along Ocean Parkway that forced law enforcement to reckon with a deeply unsettling reality. The Long Island serial killer was likely at work, and Shannon Gilbert's disappearance had shone a spotlight on the hidden dangers lurking just beyond the shoreline. Yet, in this newly unearthed horror, Shannon herself remained missing. With public fear mounting, investigators slowly expanded their efforts, combing through rough terrain with dogs and equipment, while combing through victim reports and online advertisements. Still, it wasn't until December 2011, over a year and a half after her disappearance, that skeletal remains later confirmed to be Shannon's were located in Oak Beach, the same area she had vanished. Her body was also recovered in the marsh near her belongings. A cell phone, credit cards, and jeans. All were scattered in a way that raised questions. Forensic analysis of Shannon's remains proved inconclusive regarding a cause of death. Full skeletal remains make certain conclusions harder to draw than soft tissues might. The Suffolk County Medical Examiner ruled her case inconclusive, leaving the door open to various theories. Did she meet an accidental death in the marsh, trapped by thick mud and sharp reeds, as some believed, or had she become an early victim of the Long Island serial killer, only to be brought to her watery grave? While the questions surrounding Shannon persist, her story lit a fuse. The chilling echoes of her 911 call, which captured both her determination to survive and her overwhelming fear, had become tethered to the larger discovery of what lay beneath the sands of Gilgo Beach. Yet for investigators, this was only the beginning. Shannon's disappearance was an entry point to a harrowing larger truth, one that would take years to unravel and even further propel more mysteries into the public eye. As we shift to exploring the grim discoveries at Gilgo Beach in the aftermath of this search, keep one thing in mind. Shannon Gilbert was searching for help that night. Her cries were heard, but not heeded in time. And as her story collided with those whose cries came before her, it became impossible for anyone paying attention to ignore the silence that enveloped Long Island's most vulnerable victims. The search for Shannon Gilbert expanded methodically across the area surrounding Gilgo Beach in December 2010. After months of stagnation, police had finally committed significant resources to locating her. Officers swept through the marshy terrain with cadaver dogs and other specialized equipment, navigating the cold and unforgiving environment. The sand dunes and thick vegetation of the Long Island shoreline created a quiet, desolate backdrop for their efforts. At first, it was an organized search for a single missing person, but what they discovered would transform the investigation entirely, and it wouldn't start with finding Shannon. On the morning of December 11, 2010, a canine officer leading his dog made a chilling discovery along Ocean Parkway, not far from where Shannon was last seen. Lying partially hidden amidst the brush was what appeared to be human remains. The body hadn't been there recently. This was skeletal material, and it had been wrapped carefully in burlap. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Despite initial hopes, it was quickly confirmed that the remains were not Shannon Gilbert's. This was someone else, and within days, searchers realized there was more to uncover. By December 13, police had expanded the search area and unearthed 3 additional sets of remains, each in similar conditions. Identified in early 2011, these 4 victims came to be known as the Gilgo Four: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Costello. Authorities confirmed that each woman had disappeared between 2007 and 2010, years before Shannon's case had even brought them back to the area. Their disappearances, all initially treated as isolated incidents, were now linked through this devastating discovery. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first of the Gilgo Four to vanish. She had disappeared in July 2007 while in New York City for work. A single mother from Connecticut, Maureen had been struggling to make ends meet. She had advertised on Craigslist like so many others in her line of work, and her desperation to provide for her children left her vulnerable. Her remains were among those found wrapped in burlap, suggesting a calculated and deliberate crime scene disposal. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009 at the age of 24. Originally from Buffalo, New York, Melissa had moved to the Bronx, hoping for a fresh start. To fund her ambitions, she worked as an escort, also using Craigslist to connect with clients. Melissa's case stood out to investigators because, after her disappearance, her family experienced a horrifying ordeal. Her teenage sister, Amanda, received multiple calls from someone using Melissa's phone. In each call, the man taunted Amanda, asking if she knew where her sister was. His voice was calm and emotionless. The details he provided showed he had likely been involved in Melissa's fate, yet the use of burner phones and the lack of tracing technology at the time left police with no way to track him. Megan Waterman was only 22 when she disappeared in June 2010. A mother to a young daughter, Megan came from Scarborough, Maine. She too relied on Craigslist to advertise her services and had left her home to meet someone in Long Island the night she vanished. Her family had reported her missing and repeatedly informed police of the dangers her job posed. Yet, like the others, Megan's case attracted little attention at the time. Now her remains joined those of 3 other women discovered in the same cluster. Amber Costello, the youngest of the Gilgo Four, was 27 when she went missing in September 2010. A native of North Carolina, Amber had settled in West Babylon, New York, where she lived with roommates. Described as kind-hearted and trusting, she often put her own safety at risk to support those she cared about. Amber, like the others, had advertised her services online. Her roommates later told police that Amber had left their home one evening, saying she was meeting a client. It was the last time she was seen alive. Her body, like the others, was found near Ocean Parkway. Though their stories varied, the Gilgo Four shared haunting similarities. Each of them was petite, standing around 5 feet tall and weighing close to 100 pounds. They were all in their 20s when they disappeared and had been working as escorts, advertising primarily on Craigslist. Wrapping their bodies in burlap suggested a level of care and uniformity, likely meant to avoid immediate detection. Each victim's remains had been placed within 500 feet of one another, a proximity that made it clear this wasn't random. According to Dominic Verone, then Chief of Detectives for Suffolk County, the connections between the women pointed to a deliberate targeting pattern. Whoever was responsible had chosen them carefully, luring them with crafted messages and controlled interactions. The use of burner phones only reinforced this profile. The oceanfront location of their disposal was another grim detail. Gilgo Beach sits along a stretch of barrier islands that separate Long Island from the Atlantic Ocean. It's a scenic but eerily isolated area, where sprawling marshlands meet desolate beaches. The remoteness provided whoever was responsible with a secluded dumping ground. Yet even among all the details, the burlap wrapping stood out. It wasn't entirely common, and for investigators, it suggested a methodical killer, someone who planned his movements and intentionally left little evidence behind. Beyond the physical details, the emotional impact on the community began to grow. The realization that a serial killer might be operating on Long Island sent waves of fear through the area. Families of missing women working in the same profession began to fear the worst. Advocacy groups criticized police for their initial dismissiveness, not just in Shannon Gilbert's case but in others like it. As the news of the Gilgo Four broke, public speculation swirled. People wondered how long had this killer been active? How many more victims could there be? And why had so little attention been given to the disappearances of these women before now? Law enforcement began to face the uncomfortable questions that had been building for years. Many observed that the victims, as escorts, occupied a vulnerable space in society, one often overlooked by police and the public alike. Their reliance on online platforms like Craigslist, where anonymity was easily maintained, added another layer of difficulty to tracking their movements or identifying their last contacts. Still, it was clear there was a predator out there somewhere, someone who had exploited that vulnerability to deadly effect. For years, the disappearances of women like Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber had been treated with little urgency. Now, their deaths forced Suffolk County to confront the magnitude of what had been missed. As news spread, the term Long Island serial killer began to circulate in media coverage. Yet even as police ramped up their efforts, many in the community started wondering if this killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. The scope of the area meant it was easy for someone familiar with the geography to remain unseen. Ocean Parkway itself stretches for miles, lined by tall reeds and patches of forest, making certain parts nearly impossible to search thoroughly. Investigators expanded their efforts, but challenges piled up quickly. The physical environment, coupled with the time that had elapsed since the women's deaths, made the task of gathering evidence incredibly difficult. Despite these obstacles, the discovery of the Gilgo Four was a turning point. What began as a search for a single missing woman had spiraled into a homicide investigation of unprecedented scale for Suffolk County. The realization that the beach could be doubling as a burial ground left an eerie stain on an otherwise quiet area. It wasn't just about these 4 victims. There was growing suspicion among the community and investigators alike that more bodies might be waiting to be found. Authorities shifted their focus, trying to piece together the killer's pattern. Who was he? How was he selecting his victims? And perhaps most haunting of all, was he still active? The search of Gilgo Beach had opened a door to a darker world, one filled with unanswered questions that would only grow more complex as time went on. For now, investigators could only press forward, unsure of just how expansive this case would ultimately become. The lives of the Gilgo Four, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, were distinct in many ways. Yet, the circumstances that united their tragic fates were disturbingly similar. All were young women, petite in stature, who had turned to the internet to work as escorts. They sought clients using Craigslist, a platform that promised opportunity, but also exposed them to dangers hidden behind digital anonymity. Living on society's margins, their disappearances were largely overlooked at first, treated as isolated incidents rather than pieces of a larger, coordinated pattern. But the discovery of their remains along Gilgo Beach in December 2010 connected them in ways no one could ignore. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, in many ways, was the beginning of this unsettling story. A native of Norwich, Connecticut, she was the first of the Gilgo Four to go missing. Maureen was 25 at the time and a single mother of 2 children. Despite her challenges, friends and family described her as determined and resourceful. She had begun working as an escort out of financial necessity, hoping to secure a stable life for her young family. On July 9, 2007, Maureen spoke to her sister Missy Can by phone from New York City. She mentioned she might return home that evening on a late train. That call was the last contact anyone had with her. For her family, the weeks that followed were agonizing. Maureen had always kept in close touch, so her sudden silence signaled something was terribly wrong. But her status as an escort complicated her case. Maureen quickly became another name among missing persons reports without immediate follow-up. 2 years later, in 2009, the story took a horrifying twist with Melissa Barthelemy's disappearance. At the age of 24, Melissa had moved from Buffalo to New York City, where she dreamed of making it as a hairdresser. To support herself, she worked as an escort, relying on Craigslist like Maureen had. Melissa's case gained national attention not for what was found, but for what happened in the days after her family reported her missing. Nearly a week after her disappearance, Melissa's younger sister Amanda began receiving taunting phone calls. These came from Melissa's phone, as if the older sister herself were calling, but it wasn't Melissa's voice on the other end. It was a man, calm and deliberate, telling Amanda he had killed Melissa. The calls continued for weeks, always laced with cruel remarks and horrifying details about her fate. The teenager begged for answers, but the man offered none. Officials traced the calls to Manhattan, but they were short and made from bustling public areas, preventing any attempt to pinpoint the perpetrator. Melissa's murder underscored the chilling approach of whoever was behind these acts. The phone calls weren't just a way to gloat, they were designed to instill fear, turning the family's grief into absolute terror. The killer didn't simply take life. He aimed to dismantle the lives of those left behind. Melissa's case became emblematic of the calculated and taunting behavior that would later define the Long Island serial killer's profile. Megan Waterman disappeared the following year, in 2010, a 22-year-old mother from Scarborough, Maine. Megan was known for her outgoing personality and fierce love for her young daughter, who was just 3 at the time. Megan had recently traveled to Long Island with her boyfriend, who she described as controlling. She had been working as an escort to support herself and her child, often turning to Craigslist to find clients. Megan's last known movements were captured in surveillance footage from a Holiday Inn in Hauppauge, New York. The video showed her walking out of the hotel alone, wearing casual clothing, her hair loose around her shoulders. It was the last time she was seen alive. Family members reported her missing shortly afterward, but like Maureen and Melissa, the circumstances of her work seemed to affect the urgency of the response. She became another tragic name on a growing list, one that no one had yet connected. The last of the Gilgo Four, Amber Costello, vanished in September 2010. At 27, Amber was the eldest of the group, but carried an air of vulnerability that her family often worried about. Originally from North Carolina, she had moved to Long Island, where she lived in West Babylon with her roommates. Amber had struggled with addiction, but was deeply loved by those who knew her. She had begun working as an escort to support herself and relied heavily on Craigslist to find clients. On the night of September 2, 2010, Amber told her roommate Dave Schaller that she was meeting a client who had offered her a much higher payment than usual, 1,500, significantly above her going rate. The man had specifically mentioned meeting her alone, which in hindsight raised questions about his intentions. Challa later described the client as looking like an ogre and recalled that he drove a Chevrolet Avalanche, a detail that would eventually prove crucial to the case. Amber left that night and never returned, her bubbly demeanor now only a memory to those she left behind. For all four women, the use of burner phones became a recurring, eerie thread. The killer had contacted each of them through disposable phones, keeping his tracks covered and erasing any direct way to connect their last known interactions to him. Craigslist, which many escorts used due to its wide reach, provided a perfect cloak of anonymity. Officials later learned that the burner phones used to contact the women had often pinged cell towers near Massapequa Park, Long Island. The killer's knowledge of these tools, burner phones, digital platforms, secluded locations hinted at someone who took deliberate steps to stay one step ahead of investigators. The similarities between the victims were impossible to ignore. Their ages and builds, all petite women in their 20s, were likely not coincidences. They came from different backgrounds but shared a vulnerability rooted in their circumstances. Being escorts, they existed in a profession often stigmatized and treated with suspicion, even as their cases mounted. The lack of urgency in investigating their disappearances reflected the broader societal biases against sex workers. It allowed their killer to continue undetected, perfecting his methods over time. What stood out most was how methodical the killer seemed to be. He wasn't impulsive or sloppy. The burlap used to wrap the victims' bodies, for instance, suggested preparation, a willingness to plan the details of each crime in advance. It also pointed to someone who knew how to blend into his surroundings, acting unseen in an area frequented by locals and visitors. The precise location of the bodies, tightly clustered along a quiet stretch of Gilgo Beach, spoke to repetition and routine. Whoever it was knew that stretch of land intimately, enough to use it as a dumping ground for years without drawing attention. The discovery of the Gilgo Four's remains forced investigators to rethink everything. This wasn't a single crime of opportunity or a volatile act. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had carefully selected these women, targeted their vulnerabilities, and carried out his crimes with chilling precision. The burlap sacks, the burner phones, the taunting calls, all of it pointed to a killer confident in his ability to evade capture. But as the families of the victims mourned, investigators hit a wall. Despite the pattern emerging, there was little physical evidence to connect anyone to the crimes. The killer's trail was cold, concealed by years of anonymity and forethought. Even as the community grew more fearful, law enforcement struggled to make progress. Leads dried up, and unanswered questions lingered. Was the killer still out there? And if so, when would he strike again? For now, all detectives could do was piece together the fragments, hoping something new would surface to break the deadlock. Following the discovery of the Gilgo Four in December 2010, the investigation faced immediate challenges that set the stage for nearly a decade of frustrating stagnation. Law enforcement now had evidence of at least one serial killer operating in the area, but connecting these cases was far more difficult than it seemed. Each of the four women had gone missing on separate dates, and the years of separation between their disappearances created an obstacle for finding a cohesive thread. Additionally, the women had been reported missing from different states, including Connecticut, New York, and Maine, so their cases were investigated in separate jurisdictions. The Suffolk County Police Department suddenly found itself tasked with untangling years of fragmented, incomplete information, all while facing scrutiny about why it had taken so long to determine a pattern. One of the major issues early on was a lack of hard evidence. The remains of the Gilgo Four were skeletal when discovered, leaving few forensic leads to analyze. Without soft tissue, determination of time of death, manner of death, or even environmental clues was difficult. Even the burlap used to wrap the bodies, while distinctive, yielded no usable DNA or material evidence. Leads dried up quickly. Burner phones used to contact the women added a layer of anonymity for the killer, and their movements before disappearing left no surveillance footage or witness accounts to pinpoint their final moments. Investigators combed through records, but the tools available in 2010 could not discern much from scattered digital signals. The gaps left holes big enough to stall the case indefinitely. In the months after the discovery, Suffolk County Police expanded their search around Gilgo Beach and along Ocean Parkway, uncovering additional bodies. These remains included victims who did not fit the same profile as the Gilgo Four, a toddler, an unidentified man, and women whose connections to the original cases were not clear. The public started to grapple with the idea that Long Island had become a dumping ground, but even as the body count rose, no solid clues emerged. The possibility of multiple killers, either working simultaneously or over time, complicated the focus of the investigation. This uncertainty made it challenging to determine whether similar victims should even be attributed to one person. Adding to these difficulties was Suffolk County's internal turmoil. In 2011, James Burke became the new chief of police, and his leadership would prove to be a pivotal, albeit controversial, factor in the investigation's future or lack thereof. Burke quickly came under scrutiny for withholding information, sidelining experienced officers, and failing to cooperate with federal agencies like the FBI. Key evidence that could have benefited from broader expertise remained within Suffolk County's jurisdiction, effectively cut off from the additional resources it needed. To make matters worse, Burke himself became embroiled in legal scandals, including allegations of abuse of power and obstruction of justice. His tenure created a culture of mistrust within the department, derailing any sense of cohesion among investigative teams. By the time he resigned in 2015, years of missteps and distractions had left the case colder than ever. The lack of technological advancements at the time also hindered progress. In 2010, cell phone data analysis was still in its early stages compared to today's capabilities. The records available from the burner phones used to lure the victims lacked the precision to pinpoint the killer's location or identity. This gap created a timeline where investigators could only piece together fragments of movement. Cell towers pinged in areas like Massapequa Park, but they revealed no specifics. Similarly, advances in DNA analysis were not fully available during the initial years of the investigation. Hair strands, fibers, and other materials found among the victims remained unanalyzed until later, when improved technology finally gave them renewed relevance. In the meantime, though, these potential breakthroughs sat in evidence lockers, collecting dust. As the years dragged on, public frustration swelled. Families of the victims felt abandoned, often expressing anger at how law enforcement had treated their loved ones from the start. For Mari Gilbert, Shannon Gilbert's mother, the lack of action from authorities felt like a reflection of how society viewed women like Shannon and the rest of the Gilgo Four. Their work as escorts seemed to diminish the urgency of their cases in the eyes of the police, a reality that Mari confronted openly and repeatedly. If this was someone else's daughter, she argued in interviews, they would have done something sooner. Advocacy groups and media outlets began picking up on this sentiment, pointing out the systemic neglect of sex workers and other marginalized individuals in missing persons cases. The disparities in investigative priorities were glaring, further eroding trust between the community and law enforcement. In the absence of tangible progress, rumors and speculation filled the void. The idea that a serial killer was still active grew into an ominous undercurrent of fear. By 2015, 5 years after the first bodies were uncovered, there was no confirmed suspect, no arrest, and no discernible progress. Residents of Long Island began to wonder if the killer was someone they knew, a neighbor, a co-worker, perhaps even someone in a position of authority. The lack of resolution cast a shadow over the quiet coastal community. Every unsolved disappearance or tragic death of a woman along the eastern seaboard fueled theories that the Long Island serial killer could be responsible. Competing priorities within law enforcement also contributed to the case's stagnation. Suffolk County officers were often juggling multiple investigations, from organized crime to drug-related offenses, and the resources dedicated to the Gilgo Beach case were sometimes stretched thin. In some years, staffing levels for cold case units were insufficient to handle such a sprawling and complex investigation. Without progress, the case began slipping further down the list of priorities. This dynamic left families feeling as though their loved ones' stories were being forgotten, lost in the shuffle of bureaucratic delays and shifting leadership. So, as the investigation stalled, the narrative became one of missed opportunities and fading hope. The prospect of the killer striking again lingered in the minds of victims' families and the public alike. And while officials occasionally released vague updates about reviewing evidence or reopening leads, these efforts never seemed to materialize into anything concrete. Interviews with officials often came across as speculative rather than informative, further leaving the community in the dark. By the mid-2010s, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer felt frozen in time, trapped between outdated evidence and systemic flaws. Even with new technology rolling out, it seemed Suffolk County was slow to apply it to the case. This paralysis only deepened the fears that the killer might still be active, perhaps adapting to evade detection in an age when digital footprints were harder to erase. The haunting possibility of a predator still lurking heightened the emotional weight of the case, turning it into a spectre that loomed over Long Island. For the families, though, this was not about fear or speculation. It was about justice. Yet justice seemed farther away than ever. Despite the overwhelming sense of hopelessness, something shifted in the late 2010s. New leadership, fresh perspectives, and advancements in forensic technology began to breathe life back into the Gilgo Beach case. After a decade of silence, the Suffolk County Police Department announced renewed efforts to review evidence with a focus on modern methodologies. Items once deemed insignificant, including burner phone data, fibers, and hairs, were revisited with the latest tools, offering promise where none had existed before. By 2020, whispers of progress began to emerge, hinting that the years of waiting might not have been in vain. The question hanging in the air remained: could time and innovation unlock the secrets of a case that had confounded investigators for so long? Though the past decade provided few answers, it was becoming clear that the story of the Long Island serial killer was not over. For the first time in years, hope flickered on the horizon. After years of frustration and dead ends, the formation of a new task force in February 2022 marked a critical turning point in the Long Island serial killer investigation. This renewed effort was spearheaded by Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison and Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney. Their goal was clear: to apply modern technology, fresh perspectives, and focused resources to a case that had grown stagnant since the discovery of the Gilgo 4 more than a decade earlier. The task force wasted no time. One of their first steps was a meticulous review of old case files, many of which had been scattered or underutilized during earlier investigative efforts. Over the years, leads had been overlooked and connections remained unexamined. But with technological advances that weren't available when the investigation began, the team now had tools to analyze evidence in ways that had been impossible in the past. This detailed approach brought long-forgotten details back into focus, details that would soon prove essential to identifying a suspect. A pivotal clue came from Amber Costello's case, specifically the account provided by her roommate, Dave Schaller. Back in 2010, Schaller had described the man Amber went to meet on the night she disappeared, recalling his intimidating stature and a face he said was like an ogre. Schaller also remembered something most wouldn't. The man had driven a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. While this detail had been noted in the investigation's early stages, it didn't lead anywhere at the time. Now, the task force saw potential in this detail, narrowing their search for anyone who fit the description and owned that particular vehicle model. At the same time, investigators turned their attention to phone records, an area where technology had vastly improved since the early years of the case. The use of burner phones to contact victims like Melissa Barthélemy had been a hallmark of the killer's tactics, keeping his activities hidden behind layers of anonymity. However, when the task force analyzed those phone records again, patterns began to emerge. They noticed a concentration of activity linked to a specific geographic area: Massapequa Park, Long Island. This small zone, nicknamed the Box, became a focal point for investigators, narrowing their search for suspects and resources. The combination of these two key details, the Chevrolet Avalanche and the geographic phone data, soon pointed the task force to a name that had never before come up in connection to the case: Rex Heuermann. A local architect, Heuermann lived and worked in Massapequa Park, right in the center of the area flagged by the burner phone activities. His profile raised immediate interest. Here was a man whose unassuming life and professional success allowed him to operate unnoticed while living close to the area where the victims' remains were found. The more investigators dug into his background, the more the pieces began to fit. With this new lead, the task force initiated surveillance on Heuermann to observe his behavior and gather further evidence. One key moment came when investigators spotted him entering a cell phone store. Heuermann made a payment on one of his burner phones, a critical mistake that gave investigators additional proof of his connection to the devices used to lure the Gilgo 4. This simple act of paying for the phone confirmed a direct link between him and the tools that tied him to the crimes. As investigators closed in on Heuermann, they also revisited evidence collected from the crime scenes. One significant breakthrough involved previously recovered hair. Early forensic examinations had been unable to extract usable DNA from the hair strands found near Megan Waterman's remains. However, with advancements in mitochondrial DNA analysis, these hairs could now be re-examined. The results linked the male hair found at the scene to Heuermann, further anchoring suspicions surrounding his involvement. What made the case even more damning was the connection between Heuermann's personal movements and the burner phone activity. Each time a victim was contacted, the burner phone pinged off cell towers in Massapequa Park, Investigators matched this activity to Hoyerman's work and residence locations. It was a pattern not easily explained away by coincidence. As this trail unfolded, more connections emerged, links between his technology use, his geographic footprint, and his potential access to a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. These revelations created a ripple effect for the families of the victims. For years, they had waited in agony, wondering if there would ever be answers. When news broke that a suspect had finally been identified, hope reignited among those closest to the case. For once, it feels like they're looking in the right direction, one family member said, expressing both relief and cautious optimism. Yet, even as they grasped for hope, the fear of another false start lingered in their minds. Would this be the moment when answers finally arrived, or would the trail go cold once again? By the summer of 2023, the task force gathered enough evidence to move forward decisively. The Chevrolet Avalanche, once a tiny detail buried in case files, became a cornerstone. Combined with the DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and detailed records of burner phone usage, investigators had built a solid case against Hoyerman. And it wasn't just his connection to the 4 women buried along Gilgo Beach. It was his actions, his deliberate planning, and the undeniable traces linking him to the scenes of these crimes. Rex Hoyerman was arrested in July 2023 in what became a monumental moment for one of the most elusive serial killer investigations in modern history. The evidence against him was staggering, shifting the investigation from years of uncertainty to solid ground. For the first time in over a decade, the families of the victims could begin to envision something they had almost given up hope on: justice. However, the arrest brought its own wave of questions and challenges. Would the evidence be enough to secure a conviction? And could Hoyerman be tied to other victims previously found near Gilgo Beach? This arrest wasn't the conclusion. It signaled the beginning of a new phase. Investigators and prosecutors now faced the daunting task of building a case strong enough to stand in court. Meanwhile, the community that had been haunted by this case for so long wrestled with the realization that the suspect had lived among them all along. As the investigation began its next chapter, one thing became clear. The brutal crimes along Gilgo Beach had finally been pulled back into the spotlight, no longer buried by years of oversight and missed opportunities. Justice, though late, felt one step closer. Rex Hoyerman appeared to be an ordinary man. A successful architect based in New York City, he ran his own firm out of an office in Midtown Manhattan. From the outside, his life seemed steady and unremarkable. He lived quietly in Massapequa Park, a residential town on Long Island, not far from the sandy stretches of beach that had become infamous for reasons few could comprehend. This proximity, both to the crime scenes and to the heart of New York City, was a fitting metaphor for how someone could live 2 lives, one visible, one hidden in the shadows. To those who worked with him professionally, Hoyerman might have seemed like any other accomplished architect. But in 2023, evidence surfaced suggesting that behind the facade of suburban normality lay a devastating truth. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman in July 2023 came after more than a decade of frustration and mystery surrounding the Gilgo Beach murders. All signs seemed to point to him as the elusive Long Island serial killer. Investigators had finally connected him to the crimes through a series of findings: burner phone records, eyewitness descriptions, a specific type of vehicle, and, perhaps most damningly, forensic evidence. Years of silence had been broken by methodical detective work and advances in technology, and now forgotten bits and pieces from an old case file were painting a picture that led directly to Hoyerman. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the burner phones. The killer had a history of using disposable cell phones to contact his victims, women who worked as escorts and advertised their services online. These phones were shielded by anonymity, leaving little for investigators to track in the early 2010s. However, when Suffolk County's new task force reviewed this data with modern tools, a pattern began to emerge. The phones used to lure victims like Melissa Barthelemy and Amber Costello had repeatedly pinged cell towers near Massapequa Park, Hoyerman's hometown. This tiny detail trained the investigation's sights on a very small area, and on Hoyerman, who lived and worked within the range of those signals. It was a crack in the killer's armor, one that slowly began to widen. Another key piece of evidence was the first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. This vehicle first came to investigators' attention over a decade earlier, during the investigation into Amber Costello's disappearance. On the night she vanished, Amber told her roommate she was heading to meet a client who had offered an unusually high payment, $500 in cash. The roommate, Dave Schaller, later described the client as an enormous man who resembled an ogre and drove a Chevy Avalanche. It was this detail, buried in early reports, that the task force dusted off when they reopened the case files. They discovered that during the time of the murders, Hoyerman had been the registered owner of such a vehicle. This connection was crucial not only because it matched Schaller's description, but because the car itself was later found on Hoyerman's property in South Carolina. After so many years, the avalanche had resurfaced, providing a direct link between Hoyerman's identity and Amber Costello's final client. Still, nothing was more conclusive than the DNA evidence. Investigators had recovered a male hair near Megan Waterman's remains, found wrapped in burlap and buried along Gilgo Beach. For years, this piece of evidence had been analysed, but yielded no results due to limitations in forensic technology. By 2023, mitochondrial DNA analysis had advanced enough to make more precise matches possible. But to connect the hair to Hoyerman, detectives needed a contemporary DNA sample from him. This brought them to Midtown Manhattan. Investigators followed Hoyerman closely, waiting for the right opportunity to obtain his DNA without his knowledge. The moment came when they spotted him discarding a pizza box in a trash can. It was a routine act, something anyone might do during an average workday. But for the task force, it represented the breakthrough they needed. From that discarded pizza crust, detectives extracted DNA and compared it to the profile obtained from the hair found with Megan Waterman's remains. The results were unmistakable. The DNA from the pizza and the DNA from the crime scene were a match. Years of uncertainty gave way to a hard link between Hoyerman and the murders. As damning as this evidence seemed, investigators were careful to build their case even further. They retraced every possible connection, overlaying Hoyerman's movements, phone records, and known associates against the timeline of the murders. They discovered that many of the burner phones used to contact the victims had been purchased in New York City, an area Hoyerman frequented for work. Payment records also tied back to him, solidifying his use of these devices and their role in coordinating meetings with his victims. News of his arrest on July 14, 2023, sent shockwaves across Long Island and far beyond. Hoyerman was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He was not immediately charged in connection with Maureen Brainard Barnes's death, though prosecutors named him as the prime suspect in her case as well. The focused charges suggested that law enforcement was intent on building a rock-solid case rather than overextending prematurely. Still, there was growing speculation about the other bodies found along Gilgo Beach and whether Hoyerman might be connected to more of them. Following his arrest, police executed extensive searches of Hoyerman's Massapequa Park home. Forensic teams combed through the property for 12 days, removing boxes of evidence and even digging in the backyard for potential additional remains or belongings tied to the victims. The Chevrolet Avalanche was seized, taken into custody as a piece of critical evidence in his alleged crimes. At the time of his arrest, Hoyerman also owned property in South Carolina and Las Vegas, both locations that have now become focal points for ongoing investigations to determine whether there may be other victims or if further evidence could be tied to those addresses. Hoyerman pleaded not guilty to the charges against him during his arraignment in Suffolk County Court. His defense team wasted no time in casting doubt on the evidence presented by prosecutors. His attorney, Michael Brown, stated publicly, "What has my client told me? He told me he didn't do this." Despite these claims, prosecutors stood firm, bolstered by the DNA match obtained both from the pizza crust and through a cheek swab administered after his arrest. As of September 27, 2023, this DNA had been reconfirmed in court as consistent with the hair recovered from the crime scene. Still, questions remain. Is the evidence enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? The DNA match and circumstantial connections, burner phones, vehicle records, and witness descriptions give the prosecution a strong foundation. But, as any seasoned detective knows, trials hinge on how clearly a narrative can be delivered to a jury. Defense attorneys are likely to attack the reliability of some connections, focusing on the gaps caused by the passage of time. Meanwhile, the community that once felt haunted by an invisible threat now wrestles with the idea that the killer may have been hiding in plain sight. Hoyerman lived just miles from one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern history. He went to work, came home, and existed among neighbors who likely never suspected a thing. For those who followed the case for years, the gradual reveal of his life and movements evokes more unease than relief. Though the arrest of Rex Hoyerman answered many long-standing questions about the Long Island serial killer, it also reopened the door to a disturbing consideration. If he was responsible for these crimes, might there still be others? Investigators are now faced with determining whether his arrest marks the end of the case or merely another step in unraveling a twisted story that has haunted Long Island for over a decade. In May 2011, a chilling discovery brought the investigation at Gilgo Beach into even murkier territory. During an expanded search, law enforcement uncovered 6 additional sets of remains scattered along the same stretch of coastline. This brought the known total to 10 bodies, including the Gilgo 4, while the first 4 victims followed a clear, disturbing pattern. Young, petite women working as escorts. The aftermath of this discovery raised an unsettling question. Were all these victims tied to the same killer, or had the shoreline become a dumping ground for other predators operating in the shadows? Among the additional remains was Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old escort from Washington, D.C., who had disappeared in 2003. Jessica's partial remains were first found that same year, over 40 miles away, in Manorville, Long Island. A torso had been discovered, left in the woods, but investigators could not identify her at the time. 8 years later, other parts of Jessica's body were found closer to Gilgo Beach. It was now clear that she had been one of the killer's targets, though the dispersion of her remains raised questions about the methods and motives behind her murder. Then came the discovery of Valerie Mack, also known as Jane Doe 6, until her identification in 2020 through DNA testing. Valerie, an escort and 24 years old at the time of her disappearance in 2000, had also been last seen in the Philadelphia area. Like Jessica Taylor, her remains were split between Manorville and Gilgo Beach. This distinctive pattern, partial torsos left inland, while other remains were deposited closer to the coastline, seemed to suggest a shift or evolution in the killer's behavior. Yet, it wasn't clear if this was intentional symbolism, a logistical decision, or something else entirely. Both cases hinted at more than one method of disposal, complicating efforts to link all the evidence to a single suspect. The diversity among the additional remains added further confusion to the case. One victim, known as Peaches, due to a tattoo of a peach found on her torso in 1997, would later be genetically confirmed as the mother of a toddler girl whose skeletal remains were also discovered near Gilgo Beach. A bond as intimate as motherhood made these cases particularly haunting. Yet both Peaches and her child remain unidentified, 2 victims whose stories have eluded both investigators and the public. Neither their connection to Hoyerman nor to any other suspect has been established. Even more perplexing was the discovery of an unidentified Asian male dressed in women's clothing. Authorities theorized that this individual might have been targeted for reasons unrelated to the others, potentially pointing to a wider range of victims or a more complex psychological driver behind these murders. Unlike the other remains, the male's cause of death appeared consistent with blunt force trauma, adding a disturbing new element to the killer's potential methods. Was this part of the same pattern, or a completely separate act of violence that just happened to end along the same shores? One of the oldest remains found belonged to Karen Vergata, another woman who had worked as an escort. Karen disappeared in 1996, and for decades she was known only as Jane Doe 7, until her identification was confirmed in 2023. Her presence among the victims drew the timeline of the case even further back in time, suggesting crimes that could span decades. If Hoyerman was responsible, had he begun killing in the mid-1990s? And if so, could there be even more crimes linked to him, predating or overlapping with these discoveries? The very fact that these victims lived different lives and disappeared at different times has led many experts to question whether there might be more than one killer. The Suffolk County Police Department raised this possibility early on, acknowledging that the disparities in victim profiles and methods of disposal could point to unrelated cases. Alternatively, they theorized, one person might have been responsible by tailoring their actions to evade detection. Forensic experts have even debated the mental profile of a potential suspect or suspects. Could one person's motive encompass this broad range of victims and methods? Or were multiple predators exploiting the same vulnerabilities and dumping ground? Complicating matters, investigators have since broadened their focus to encompass Rex Hoyerman's life outside Long Island. After his arrest in July 2023, detectives began examining properties he owned in other states, including South Carolina and Las Vegas. In South Carolina, investigators searched Hoyerman's property for possible evidence linked to other unsolved cases. Through their thorough examination, officials have removed boxes of potential forensic materials, though they have not disclosed specific findings. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, cold case detectives have reviewed missing persons reports and homicides, probing the possibility that Hoyerman committed additional crimes while traveling for work or personal reasons. The effort to connect Hoyerman to other crimes remains ongoing. While no additional charges have been filed as of yet, law enforcement across multiple states has taken a renewed interest in cold cases that share similarities with the murders near Gilgo Beach. Whether these efforts turn up hard evidence remains unclear, but the sheer scope of the investigations signals the gravity of Hoyerman's potential crimes. How many lives did his path intertwine with, and how many families could finally gain closure, no matter how bitter. This uncertainty leaves the door open for future developments. If new evidence emerges, prosecutors could bring further charges against Hoyerman. For the families whose loved ones remain unidentified among the Gilgo victims, this provides a slim but important hope that their stories might still find resolution. As one official remarked during the 2023 press briefings, the case remains very active. While prosecutors have focused on securing a conviction in the murders of the Gilgo Four, they continue to track leads on the identities of other victims and investigate how deeply Hoyerman's darkness may have run. Even now, some victims remain nameless, their identities reduced to placeholders like Jane Doe, 3, or Peaches. Their lives, while faded from memory, are far from forgotten. The families of the unidentified victims continue to live in limbo, waiting for the phone call or DNA match that could finally replace unknown with a name. For every breakthrough, there remains a stretch of time where silence weighs heavier than answers. Without definitive connections tying all 10 bodies to one person, the puzzle of who else could be involved lingers like a shadow over the investigation. In many ways, the Long Island serial killer case stands as a stark reminder of the challenges in untangling crimes that span decades. It highlights not just the acts of the predator or predators, but also the systemic failings that allowed these killings to go unchecked for so long. Weaknesses in earlier investigations, combined with less advanced forensic techniques and societal dismissiveness of sex workers, created an environment where a killer could thrive in anonymity. Even now, as modern technology has cracked critical pieces of the puzzle, investigators find themselves racing against an ever-lengthening timeline filled with gaps and uncertainties. Though Rex Hoyerman has been arrested, his guilt in these murders is not yet determined by the courts, and even if a conviction is secured, the case itself may never truly close. The discovery of additional bodies near Gilgo Beach hints at a far broader story, one that may stretch further back, encompass other suspects, or involve unspeakable acts not yet unearthed. Could there still be another, as-yet unseen predator out there? Or do the answers lie solely within Hoyerman's dark double life? For now, we're left with fragments of a still unfinished story. The search for justice remains active, but so do the lingering mysteries. Mysteries that haunt not just the shores of Long Island, but families, communities, and investigators who refuse to let these victims fade into obscurity. This case, far from being resolved, continues to remind us just how many secrets the sands of Gilgo Beach might still hold. The families of the Gilgo Four, the women whose lives were cut short and whose remains were discovered along Gilgo Beach, have endured a long and painful wait for answers. Their grief has been compounded by years of delays, missteps, and the lingering feeling that the system underestimated the urgency of their loved ones' cases. For these families, closure has felt like an elusive promise, always out of reach, yet desperately needed. Missy Can remembers the night her sister Maureen Brainerd Barnes called for the last time. It was late July in 2007, and Maureen, ever the big sister, had been trying to assure Missy that everything was fine. She was calling from a payphone in New York City, from Penn Station to be exact, where she said she was planning to catch the midnight train home, but Maureen never boarded that train, and from that moment on, her voice was silenced. Missy's account of their final conversation highlights the heartbreak of those left behind, a sudden absence punctuated by endless questions. What happened after that call? Who did she meet? Why wasn't there an immediate response to find her? These are the questions that have haunted Missy throughout the years, shaping her efforts to keep Maureen's name in the public eye. For the families, the early years of the investigation were defined by frustration. Law enforcement's initial response to the women's disappearances often reflected dismissive attitudes, rooted in the stigma surrounding their work as escorts. Leads were slow to follow, and many families felt they weren't being taken seriously. This was exacerbated by the scattered jurisdictions from which each woman had gone missing. Megan Waterman disappeared from Long Island, and Melissa Barthélemy vanished from the Bronx, while Maureen Brainerd Barnes was last seen in Manhattan, and Amber Costello disappeared from a nearby Long Island suburb. This fragmentation meant police departments handled their cases separately, not yet realizing they were all connected to a much larger story. While the investigators struggled to piece things together, the families were left in limbo. Time stretched on with few updates, pushing these loved ones into a painful cycle of waiting and wondering. For Mari Gilbert, the mother of Shannon Gilbert, the refusal to accept law enforcement's lack of urgency became a defining battle. Mari refused to stay quiet, attending press conferences, contacting reporters, and publicly challenging local officials to give her daughter's case the attention it deserved. Even when faced with indifference or opposition, she pressed forward, often saying that she wouldn't rest until Shannon's true story was brought to light. Though Shannon's case differed from the Gilgo Four in key ways, the passion and determination Mari brought to her pursuit resonated with other grieving families, inspiring them to raise their voices in the face of extraordinary loss. For Megan Waterman's daughter, Liliana, the loss of her mother carries a different kind of weight. Liliana was only 3 years old when Megan disappeared, meaning she has spent her entire life trying to understand the person her mother was. During a television interview years later, Liliana expressed the thoughts that countless others must have felt, the simple desire to say, "I love you" one more time. Her words, "I never got to really say those words," underline the profound ripple effect loss has on those who, because of age or circumstance, were never given closure. A lifetime of longing, shaped by questions that a child should never have to carry, marks Liliana's journey. The pain of losing a loved one was amplified by the idea that the killer might still be at large. Each passing year felt like another reminder that the system had failed. The families watched helplessly as public attention shifted away from their loved ones, as leads dried up and as hope waned. Yet through this, their voices remained constant, fighting against the tide to ensure the victims weren't forgotten. They spoke at media events, participated in documentaries, and partnered with advocacy groups to shine a renewed light on the case. This collective effort kept the women's stories alive, even when it seemed the investigation was losing ground. Advocacy groups played an essential role during the quiet years of the investigation. Organizations focused on helping families of crime victims worked to highlight the injustices many believed had plagued the handling of the case. They organized vigils, called for task forces, and pushed for transparency in the investigation. In the process, they helped amplify the families' voices while pushing the broader narrative that sex workers, often marginalized and overlooked, deserve the same urgency and care in investigations as any other victim. For Missy Can, her openness about Maureen's life wasn't just an act of grieving, it became an act of defiance. Speaking about her sister's struggles with financial pressures and her decision to become an escort wasn't easy, but Missy believed it was necessary to humanize Maureen in the eyes of an often judgmental public. Whether through interviews or events, Missy ensured that Maureen wasn't reduced to a statistic, explaining that she was a devoted sister and an irreplaceable part of their family. Similarly, Melissa Barthelomew's teenage sister, Amanda, endured unimaginable trauma as the recipient of taunting calls made by the killer. Despite the horror, Amanda remained vocal about Melissa's disappearance, serving as a reminder of just how much the killer's crimes extended beyond the victims themselves, leaving behind an unrelenting aftermath. When Rex Hoyerman was arrested in 2023, it marked a turning point for the victims' families. For over a decade, their lives had been in limbo, filled with unanswered questions and almost no resolution. While the capture of a suspect brought clarity to some aspects of the case, it didn't erase the pain of the years lost or the struggles endured. Families like Maureen's, Megan's, Melissa's, and Amber's now focus their energy on the next stage, the trial. They understand that while the arrest of Hoyerman brought relief, it also marked the beginning of yet another challenging chapter in their efforts to see justice served. The legal process is rarely swift, and the wait for a trial has kept the families in a place of profound uncertainty. The burden grows heavier as details surrounding the crimes emerge, forcing them to relive some of the most painful moments of their lives. Still, their determination to honor their loved ones remains constant. This strength has been their unifying trait through years of accusation, delay, and uncertainty. Even with the potential for legal resolution, it's clear that justice won't bring these women back, nor will it truly close the gaping hole left in their families' lives. What it will do, however, is offer recognition of the lives they lived, the struggles they faced, and the unimaginable cruelty they suffered. Recognition that they mattered. The family's fight for justice hasn't just been about their own loved ones. It has also been about advocating for systemic change, calling attention to how investigations often overlook or deprioritize victims who come from marginalized backgrounds. They've reminded the public and law enforcement alike that every life has value, regardless of circumstance, and that every family deserves answers, no matter the obstacles. While the spotlight now shines on Hoyerman and the details of his alleged crimes, the families remain steadfast in reminding the world of what truly matters. The women whose lives were stolen, who were mothers, sisters, daughters, and friends. Those whose names might have been forgotten without the tireless work of those who loved them. For these families, the fight isn't over. It won't be over until justice is fully served, until every victim is identified, and until every question has an answer. While the process will undoubtedly stretch on into the future, one thing is certain: they will never stop fighting. Their perseverance has ensured that their loved ones' stories remain heard, and that silence will never again settle over the sands of Gilgo Beach. The Long Island serial killer case did more than shock a community. It called into question how society approaches the pursuit of justice for victims from vulnerable populations and revealed the systemic blind spots that allowed a killer or killers to evade capture for so long. The lessons learned from this investigation stretch far beyond the beaches of Long Island. This case has left behind critical questions about policing, technology, and the way victims are treated in the legal system, all while reinforcing just how fragile the processes meant to protect individuals can be. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders became a study in the ripple effects of prioritization, or rather, a lack thereof. At the time the victims first began disappearing, their cases were handled with a disjointed urgency at best. Each woman's disappearance was seen as isolated and unconnected to the others, perhaps because their work as online escorts made them easy for some to dismiss as transient or inherently at risk. This tendency to deprioritize crimes involving sex workers remains one of the darkest themes of the case. Too often, law enforcement agencies rely on stereotypes when making decisions about which cases receive critical resources early on. The need for more equitable treatment and protection for marginalized communities within the criminal justice system has lingered at the heart of discussions surrounding Gilgo Beach. Many believe that had the victims fallen into a different demographic, the authorities might have acted sooner, shortening the killer's spree or saving lives. Beyond the victims' work or backgrounds, the fragmented nature of the resources used to investigate the disappearances raised additional challenges. With reports originating in vastly different jurisdictions, New York City, Maine, Connecticut, there was little collaboration at the start. Early coordination failures between police precincts allowed critical patterns to go unnoticed until it was too late to intervene. It was only after the discovery of remains along Gilgo Beach that agencies began working together, but the years of delay leading up to that point exposed flaws in communication and resource sharing, not just at the local or state level, but across federal lines as well. The eventual involvement of the FBI, particularly in analyzing phone records and helping identify technology-based evidence, highlighted how crucial cross-jurisdictional collaboration can be, especially where serial crimes or cold cases are concerned. The significance of modern forensic technology cannot be overstated in this case. The breakthroughs that ultimately connected Rex Heuermann to the murders depended on advancements that weren't available when the first bodies were discovered. Forensic science had evolved considerably in the years since 2010. The hair recovered from the burlap wrap near Megan Waterman's body sat dormant in evidence lockers for years, powerless to lead investigators to a suspect. But with improvements in mitochondrial DNA analysis, it became possible to match that sample to Heuermann in 2023, bringing perhaps the most damning evidence to the forefront. Similarly, the use of a discarded pizza crust to confirm a DNA link underscores the importance of such techniques in ensuring cold cases are not forgotten. It's moments like these that remind investigators and the public how critical investment in forensic science truly is. Without it, many long unsolved cases would remain locked in the past. Technology also played a central role in tracing Heuermann's digital activities. The killer's use of burner phones had once seemed like an unbreakable shield, frustrating investigators who lacked the tools to track these devices in real time. Years later, advancements in cell tower data analysis enabled authorities to re-examine the information, pinpointing connections between the burner phones and the Massapequa Park area where Heuermann lived. This breakthrough turned what had once been a dead end into a major lead, ultimately tightening the net around the suspect. Yet, the investigation also revealed a deeper challenge, balancing the benefits of technological access with privacy concerns. Burner phones remain a grey area in law enforcement, with debates ongoing about how these tools might be regulated in the future to aid similar investigations while respecting individual rights. The societal implications of the Long Island case extend beyond the forensic or technological. It forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about how vulnerable populations are treated by the justice system and by society as a whole. The stigma surrounding the victim's profession didn't just hinder public perception. In some cases, it slowed the very process of searching for them. Missing person reports for sex workers are too often overlooked or treated as lower priority cases, particularly when adults are involved. This perception of lifestyle risk creates a bias that can leave sex workers and other marginalized groups, especially vulnerable to violent crime. In response to such issues, victim advocacy groups have pushed for more nuanced investigations that avoid moral judgment while focusing on the human lives at stake. The Long Island case serves as a stark reminder of how dangerous it can be to allow societal biases to creep into criminal investigations. Another valuable takeaway is the critical role victim advocacy and community voices can play in keeping a case alive. During the years when the investigation stagnated, it was the victims' families and evolving media coverage that kept the case in the public eye. Families of the Gilgo Four, in particular, refused to let their loved ones disappear without a fight, maintaining pressure on law enforcement by keeping their stories visible. The families worked with advocacy groups to raise awareness around the lack of urgency in the earlier stages of the investigation. This persistence paid off in 2022 with the formation of a new task force, bringing fresh eyes to the case and reigniting traction toward justice. It's a powerful reminder that when systems falter, communities and especially families have the ability to push for accountability and results. The Long Island serial killer case also demonstrates the importance of understanding how predators exploit new tools. In this instance, the killer's use of online platforms to locate, contact, and lure victims underscores the dangers such technologies can enable. Craigslist, a platform once unregulated and widely used for escort advertisements, provided anonymity that worked in the killer's favor. Situations like these have sparked wider conversations about improving safety in online environments, especially for users working in high-risk industries. While policymakers tread carefully to avoid infringing on legitimate uses of such platforms, the need for safeguards remains a growing focus area for public safety advocates. At its core, this case raises one of the most uncomfortable questions. Have we learned enough to prevent something like this from happening again? The advancements in technology and collaboration that ultimately led to a suspect's arrest are undeniably encouraging, but they don't guarantee a foolproof system going forward. Serial crimes, by their nature, exploit systemic vulnerabilities. If more emphasis isn't placed on early red flags, disappearances that might seem isolated at first but point to a larger pattern, it's all too easy for dangerous individuals to operate undisturbed. In reflecting on this case, officers, policymakers, and advocates alike continue to weigh what still needs to change in the years ahead. Finally, this case underscores the need to support not only investigations but the recovery of those left behind. The trauma faced by the victims' families is a crucial, often overlooked part of the story. Groups that offer advocacy, counseling, and restorative services to grieving loved ones have reported the far-reaching impact of such violent crimes. The families of the victims have faced immense emotional and psychological trauma, as noted, and this case brought to light the ongoing need for more robust services to meet those needs. Public awareness campaigns fueled by the case have also shone a spotlight on these challenges, emphasizing the importance of funding for grief support and victim advocacy organizations. When we look back at the Long Island case, it serves as much more than a chapter in true crime history. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of oversight, the power of persistence, and the fragility of protections for the most vulnerable. For those involved, there are no neat conclusions, but every advancement in the case, even one as long delayed as the eventual arrest of Rex Heuermann, underscores the importance of collective effort. From families refusing to give up, to scientists applying cutting-edge tools to uncover hidden truths, these efforts serve as a reminder that while justice may be slow, it's no less critical for the victims whose stories demand to be told. And for future cases yet to come, this legacy carries an urgent message. No victim should ever be dismissed, no matter their circumstances, and no case should ever rest while questions remain unanswered. The Long Island serial killer case stands as a stark reminder of the importance of persistence. Early missteps and the marginalization of vulnerable victims, like the Gilgo Four, stalled progress for years. But the tireless determination of families, advocacy groups, and investigators ensured the search for justice endured. The need for more equitable treatment and protection for marginalized communities within the criminal justice system remains clear even now. This case highlights the power of renewed effort and evolving technology, offering hope for other unsolved cases. Stay informed, share these stories, and support initiatives that amplify the voices of the forgotten.